Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring the idea of being funny. Funny, that is, in the sense of engaging people, not necessarily by making them laugh, though obviously it can include that. What I'm not talking about is funny in the sense of strange or odd, though of course they are interrelated. Being odd and strange can and does often grab our attention, even when it shouldn't. I'm interested in the concept of being funny, as in making people laugh and engaging them, because I think it goes to the essence of being human. Things and people that are funny grab our attention, and so there's the potential for us to use it to mitigate human risk. If you're in compliance, knowing how to engage an audience is a very useful skill, just as it is for anyone else in business. But equally, being funny can also be associated with human risk. We can think of people making unprofessional jokes. To help me navigate all of this, I'm speaking to Paul Dornan, a comedy writer and founder of a company called True Funny. Paul helps people to find what uniquely makes them funny and to bring it out in their work. Most obviously in the way that they do presentations, but also in terms of how they present themselves more broadly. We hear a lot about being the best version of ourselves, and that, in essence, is what Paul helps people to do. Because if you want to be funny in a way that's true to yourself, you need to know who you are. What you're about to hear is a fascinating discussion. We begin by exploring Paul's career as a comedy writer, how he came to work with one of the comedy greats of all time, who sadly died recently, Barry Humphries, and Paul has some great stories about him, and then also how Paul sees being funny as a skill that's not just a nice to have, but an absolute necessity. I think he's right, which is why I'm spending time with Paul to find out what makes me truly funny and how I can maximise that. Now rest assured, I'm paying for that myself, so this episode definitely isn't a paid promotion for Paul's business. Rather, it's a fascinating dive into the things that make us funny and how we can use that to our advantage. As regular listeners will know, there's only one advertisement I run on this show, and that's for my book, Humanising Rules Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance. You'll find a link to that, and where you can read some sample chapters for free, in the show notes. With all of that said, it's time for you to hear my discussion with Paul Dornan. And since we're talking about comedy, there are lots of references to comedy characters, actors, and shows. If you're unfamiliar with any of them, which you might be if you're not that familiar with British comedy, there's a link to them in the show notes. Unsurprisingly, this was a lot of fun to record, and Paul is great company. So please enjoy my discussion with Paul Dornan on finding your true funny. Paul, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Oh, thank you, Christian. Oh, does that mean it's all mine now? You're just giving it, is that welcome in the sense of have the human, now it's the Paul Dornan Human Risk podcast, is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm sure Paul Dornan is full of human risk, as we're about to find out on this episode. But in order for us to do that, I guess, Paul, the easiest thing to say about you is that your background is in writing comedy. And I guess the simple question is, it's not a standard career. How does one become a comedy writer? What inspired you to do that?
Well, in a way, in a funny kind of way, I come from an Irish family. And one of the things that put food on the table when I was a kid was laughter, really. I mean, my dad wasn't a professional comedian. He was a professional Irishman at the time in the 70s, because he was a pub landlord, and he ran, hilariously, a bar at Heathrow Airport in the control tower for the people who worked there. Now, I'd just like you to think about that sentence and try and put it through the lens of one health and safety. It was the 70s. They had this enormous bar underneath the control tower where all the people who worked at Heathrow Airport, it wasn't for the passengers at all. It looked very prepossessing, very industrial. You wouldn't know it was there. But you went through these big double doors, and inside was this enormous, slightly grim, smoke-filled bar that looked like something from Star Wars, a Star Wars bar if it had been filmed by Ken Loach, it was that kind of thing. And it was really grim old place. And my dad was the landlord of that place. And what he used to do was he lit it up every day, because he stood there in a pinstripe suit, a Hector Power, I think it was called. I remember my mum going on about Hector Power suits, pinstripe suit with a pink carnation in his lapel every day. He dressed like that, and he stood at the end of the bar, and he was the sort of mine host in that very old-fashioned way. and he kind of made the place tick. And he would stand there and he'd get all his people come in and he'd gather them around in it. There'd be massive, mammoth 1970s, wholly inappropriate joke sessions, those sorts of things. And then people would come in, and if it was getting a bit boring and an airline pilot walked in, my dad would grab these sort of middle-aged men, start dancing with them to the jukebox. Or if the action was getting very flat, he'd get hold of a broom handle, I remember, and he'd run out to where the pool table was, where all these expert pool players were playing, and he'd take on the best one using the broom. And obviously, sometimes he'd win, which was caused massive hilarity. So it was huge drama. He got people, he knew about everybody, he knew the gossip. He kind of made it tick. You saw the baggage loaders in these brown uniforms in the days before wheelie suitcases. We had thousands of baggage handlers and people getting taking things through the terminals, all those guys. And they had the most amount of money I've ever seen anywhere. They all had wads of cash. They would walk in and buy 3 triple scotches and then and peel off a £10 note and give it to you. There was those sorts of people. There were pilots. There were people from the bank. I mean, there were policemen, the special branch. There were all the journalists, of course, who hang around the airport in those days. Because do you remember the days when somebody arriving at Heathrow Airport would be a big picture in the newspaper? It was so exciting. I mean, Heathrow Airport, at one point, when I was a kid and used to go there with my dad, they had a live commentary show going on every day with a commentator say, "Oh, look, there's a BC-10 arriving from Santiago in Chile," and everyone would clap when the plane arrived. I mean, it was just a different world. So and as in the control tower bar, one of my dad's best customers was a guy called Joe the Shake. He used to drink special brew, which is an evilly strong, not evil, but evilly strong lager. And his hands would shake a little bit as he's doing it. And so after a while, I said, "Joe, where does Joe work?" He said, "Oh, I think he's chief air traffic controller." It's that kind of place. It's madness, utter madness. And this horrible, grim workers' bar ended up being the pub, terrifyingly, that sold the most amount of alcohol in southern England. We were in the 70s because of my dad really making it buzz and lively. It wasn't. So people used to go. It was like Christmas Eve every day in there. It was nuts. So as a kid, I used to go there, and sometimes later on, when I was a student, I worked there. So I was there browsing out. I saw all this going on, and it's jokes have always been around. My dad was a big joke teller. He wasn't kind of a big, huggy, "I'll tell you our truths." Everything was just sitting there and telling jokes, really. So that was in the blood. And then when I went to university, I did a bit of Cambridge footlights because I was at Cambridge, and I did a bit of that.
And so for people that aren't familiar, just talk a little bit about the Cambridge footlights, because it's a big thing in the world of comedy. But just explain what it is.
Yeah. Well, it's basically a little room in a cellar in Cambridge that's been responsible for vast amounts of the comedy that the world's enjoyed. I mean, the Pythons, John Cleese, the Goodies, Peter Cook. Amazing people have come through this little club, and they put on a review every year, which then tours the country. It's quite a big deal for a student thing. A lot of professional. Stephen Fry came from there, Hugh Laurie, Emma Thompson. They all went through this. And in fact, they were just, obviously a few years before me. They were the big comedy gods. And, they went on from that almost straight into stardom. So it's quite a big, for a little student club, it was incredibly high pressure. And they used to do these things called smokers, where you'd come along and do your sketch, And I did my first sketch was I walked in, and they hadn't said, "Oh, we're doing a documentary about the footlights." And this is a tiny room of, I think, 35 people. And the first 2 rows were all the famous people who'd been in the footlights. In the front row, facing me, the first time I ever did a comedy thing, was Peter Cook. He was about 1.5 feet from me. Talk about daunting. Like, I'm taking up football. I'm playing in the cup final tomorrow. It was that really. So it was pretty good. I got through that, and I did some stuff with the footlights. I wasn't ever in their main show, and I wrote things, and that they used them, and it was good fun. It was all a bit soft. Some of the people who were in charge in my time were a bit they were a bit soppy for me. I was a bit more edgy and political than they were prepared to go, so I didn't go that way. But then after university, I was going to be an actor. I was doing a play with a very young Sam Mendes, the director of American Beauty and one of the world's top directors now. So I did a play with him, but and while I was doing this play for a laugh, I applied for a job on the Dame Edna experience. You know, Barry Humphries' Dame Edna thing, just out of the paper in the Guardian. I wrote in this application. Just I thought, well, I don't know what I'm going to do after my play with Sam Mendes, and then and I got an interview, and then I got the job. I couldn't believe it. It was nuts. So I ended up working in television with Barry Humphries, which is an amazing experience. And then after that, I kind of got into it. I worked with Boy George, I think because they hired me because they thought rather crassly and wrongly, well, there's another man who wears a dress. So, you know, Paul could deal with him, which is a Boy George, Boy George and George and Barry Humphries couldn't be more different people. Well, they're both, well, they actually do share certain things. They're very, very intelligent people, very, very smart. Boy George is an incredibly smart man and really interesting. So I enjoyed working with him. And then I went on and worked with an Australian comedy guy called Jonathan Coleman, who's a late departed and very, very dear friend of mine. And then I got into proper TV of making dramas and comedy dramas, and I've done sitcoms, and I worked with Christopher Lloyd for Back to the Future. I did a whole series out in Spain with him, and I put him on a white horse at an Indian wedding, which is one of my proudest moments, seeing him coming across the hill. It's this funny thing about writing stuff. You sit in your room and you say, wouldn't it be really funny if Doc from Back to the Future has to come dressed as an Indian bridegroom across a Spanish hill with S Club 7 dancing around him. And then one day you're standing on the Spanish hill, it's actually happening. And that's what did happen. that's pretty mad as well. So yeah, I've done all those sorts of things, and I've done some proper serious dramas as well, which is good fun. I did a film for ITV. And, you know, it's been an interesting, really interesting career. And I love working with smart people to try and, you know, tell things to the world. That's what you're doing in TV. That's what you're doing in comedy. I think you've got your things to say in a way. I mean, not preachy and lectury, but you've got things that you notice about the world, and you try to say them in as entertaining and original and uncliched and as meaningful way as possible. So that's kind of why moving into this world of helping people with speeches and things isn't at all a massive gear change. You know, it's the same sort of idea. It's like different form. You know, you're finding ways to in a drama, you're trying to find a story that means something to people, that helps them see the world in a different way. And that's what I love about it.
You mentioned Barry Humphries, who was recently departed.
Yes, very sad.
One of those people that I don't think I've seen a single thing that he's done either as himself or as a character that didn't at some point have me absolutely corpsing with laughter, because he's just like one of these sort of natural. I mean, just give us a sense of what it's like to work with someone like that, because I imagine it would just be an absolute blast.
Yeah, I mean, he's a serious guy, Barry. Barry was a very serious guy. I mean, in person, he's different, as all people are. A lot of performers are slightly different. I mean, especially the more comedy the performer are, often the more difference between their on-stage and off-stage energies. Some of them are exactly the same, like Rory Bremner, but a lot of them aren't, you know. And Barry in person was this incredibly well-dressed European intellectual who collected Klimt art and had a fantastic collection of books that are worth a fortune, and knew all about avant-garde American French music from the 1930s. He was an intellectual, weird intellectual, and quite kind of poised and grave in a way, but also then cheeky and funny. And then as Edna was this kind of terrifying creature. When you met Barry, you worked with Barry for 3 months, then you meet Edna for the first time. It's a totally different person. You know, it's a totally different energy. It's not like, oh, there's the same person in a dress. It really isn't. It's like a completely different person. And Dame Edna doesn't know who you are, even though you've been sitting talking to him for 3 months, you know. So it's really, it was really astounding to work with him. And he worked a show like that, or how it happened was Barry would come in. We decided on the guests. And so say I managed to talk them into doing Ted Heath, you know, the former British Prime Minister, who was, you know, famously quite a serious guy and a bachelor. And I managed to say, well, why don't you do Ted Heath? And there was a bit of doubt around, but we got Ted Heath to say yes. And then I'd have to go and see Ted Heath. And I met him for about 3 or 4 hours in his house in London. And he told me all about Chairman Mao and Richard Nixon and the ending of the Cold War, and which is fascinating, but it's not kind of quite ITV on a Saturday night comedy stuff. So I noticed that the woman who served us tea was a Spanish housekeeper. And I just locked that one away in my head, and I went back to Barry. And you go back to Barry, you sit in this room with him and his writer, Ian Davidson, who's quite a lovely man, and they would just kind of kick ideas around. So I said this thing about the Spanish housekeeper, and Barry's eyes lit up because he suddenly had a little bit, a little bit of grit to build the oyster from, which is something from real life. He has a Spanish housekeeper, which is sort of not unexpected. And then, so of course, then turns out Edna has a Spanish housekeeper too, So Barry says that it's just my house keeper's called Concepcion. And I said, what about if the housekeeper's called Contracepcion, Barry? And Barry gave me this look of like, and that was kind of how I think, actually, weirdly, that moment when Barry said it. And then when he did it on the show, got an enormous laugh. I think a round of applause. And I just suddenly thought, yeah, maybe comedy's for me. So you learn a lot from Barry. He was such an amazing talent. And you just take small things that people can relate to is what, the genius of Edna is all about her autobiography and all the little things that happened to her. And, it's not about the big stuff, really. It's all about the very small things, because that's what people's lives are built on. And you build from the small to the huge. I learned a lot from him, and he was an extraordinary man. Very glad to have done it.
I'll put a link to that interview that you're referring to in the show notes for anybody that wants to watch it. But it is, as you say, it's a wonderful moment of a very, very serious politician, somebody that I don't think until watching that I'd ever seen him express any sort of emotions apart from very serious ones. And so there was this wonderful ability to, I guess, bring out the human in everybody.
Exactly. And that's what happened with Heath, actually. Mr. Heath was quite surprised by it, because Barry does a joke, and Ted Heath, bless him, comes back with a really funny thing that absolutely quick wit, reacting to Barry. He sort of like raised his game. Suddenly he's running in, he's playing in the cup final too, out of nowhere. And the interesting thing, when I posted that on Twitter, thousands of people reacted to it because they hadn't seen this side of him. And you look at it and you think, it's almost a tragedy, really, that these politicians like him, he had that in him, but there's something about the system and his idea of what he should be and the dignity of Prime Minister, which we know so much about now after the Boris Johnson era, how much the dignity, it's all about dignity, isn't it? And in this country, we've understood the true dignity, with Trump and Johnson. And so he was, he was really totally unable to allow himself the luxury of being truly himself, and Ted Heath, I mean. And that was it gives you a real glimpse. You think, if you'd done that more often, you could have been a really popular prime minister that people could have really connected to, but unleashing that little bit inside you, the truth inside you of your personality, people hold themselves back so much, don't they? You know what I mean? You've seen it in business. People on stage look like they're really, they're so serious and dull. And then afterwards, they're life and soul of the party. You think, well, just take a little bit of that magic and spread it around the rest of your life. Don't put things in compartments, dip into that and, spray it around. That's what, put it everywhere.
And so that became your career,
Mm.
and you've never looked back since. And having written a number of successful things, you're now branching out into helping people like me, actually, because you and I are working together, full disclosure, and
Yes.
helping people to be funny. But what I found really interesting, and the reason that I was keen to work with you, was you're not about making people funny in an artificial way. As the name of your company implies, true funny. It's about finding what makes them funny. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I think that lots of people look at comedy and say, well, what has that got to do with business? And I'm not naturally funny, and all those kinds of objections.
Yeah. Well, there's lots to be said about that. I mean, the first thing is, funny is a very big word. I mean, it's a good title word for my company, but funny to me encompasses all kinds of things, and it encompasses, everything. It's a whole gamut. It's a massive bandwidth of stuff, from being just, from being searingly funny to make people cry with laughter, down to being witty, down to being incisive, down to being ironic, down to being playful, down to being teasing, but down to being, little chuckles, little moments of truth, just things that to me, funny is an catch-all phrase for kind of human, really. It's an alternative to human. And I think what's amazing in business is that people go out of their way to say, well, business isn't human. And I think, what's been going on the last few years, it seems in lots of different ways, is that people have been bringing the world of work and business and thinking about it and talking about it back to the reality that they're all part of the human experience. And big part of the human experience in whatever you do, however you interact with the world, is laughter, is generosity, is reaching out and connecting to people, not through hostility or by pure power. It's by engaging with them and making them have a chuckle with you. I mean, when two rival gangs of blokes get together in a pub, they collide in a pub. There's two things that can happen, it seems to me. One, there's going to be a huge fight about the pretty girl behind the bar. Or, before you know it, everyone's making each other laugh. They're teasing each other about their haircuts or what football teams they think. They have another drink, and suddenly the laughs start flowing, the connections start flowing, and these two groups of strangers leave arm in arm 3 hours later. And that, to me, is something that's sort of been left out of the business equation, puzzlingly, because people think, laughter and being amusing and all those things aren't serious. Well, to me, my experience of comedy has told me that some of the most profoundly serious people I've ever met have been in the world of comedy, because, as I said, it's a place with nowhere to hide. It's a place of deep human truths, So that doesn't mean that it's without thought or without intellectual caliber or analytical worth. Comedy is an extremely intelligent way of looking at the world, it seems to me. So you'd be mad to leave it out of your toolkit. I mean, and I think lots of people are getting that now. I think it's part of that whole humanization conversation that business is having with itself. It's realizing that it has to be part of the rest of society. And nobody spends that and say, "Oh, I'm not funny." It's a nonsense to me. What you spend your entire you go to your brother-in-law's barbecue, and what do? You get a PowerPoint out, you start a lecture about the probability forecasts. No, you don't. You stand around, you tell stories, and you try to be funny. You try to engage with people as a humorous, lovely, warm, likable human being. So why the hell would you not want to do that when it comes to your business life? It works at the barbecue. It works everywhere else. Why are you saying it's not something I'm going to be doing at work? Crazy.
One of the arguments that people use, and I've used this, I don't think I've ever said it, but I've sort of used it in my head, is the question of appropriateness. Right. So one of the reasons you might say, well, I can't do comedy because that feels inappropriate. And okay, so even if I accept your point that it's a good way to communicate, the barbecue example is a good illustration of I can say things at the barbecue that I better not say that at work. And so there's a risk of me being inappropriate. And in a world where people are getting cancelled and we have to be a bit more careful about how we express ourselves, you could concoct an argument that would say it's a dangerous thing to do. And so steer clear of that because that comes with risk.
Yeah. Well, yes. You're in the world of risk. And as you know, the other side of that word risk is reward. And yes, there are risks. And of course, one has to be incredibly careful, especially in the business context of what one's. I'm not saying you go in tearing into people. I really don't think business is a place for sarcasm, particularly, or massive satirical attacks. It's not, time to be withering. It's not about all those things, but it can be time to be, generous and funny, principally about yourself. The biggest safety valve you always got is you start the thing you're funny about before you're funny about anything else is yourself. So if you're mocking yourself, if you're tearing yourself down, if you're exposing your own flaws through stories of where you've messed up, because let's face it, a good comic story is normally a story of a screw up, because nobody ever laughed at something where you tell people how fabulous you are. That's it's a very simple
there are
truth.
certain politicians I can think of that are inadvertently funny, right? Because they're so ridiculous.
Well, of course.
But no, you're right.
But we're seeing the screw up. We're seeing the disconnect between what they're saying and what they're doing, And part of what their appeal, us looking at them, we can be amused by them because they don't know themselves. And I think the true funny approach to this is to, first of all, I mean, the thing I say is a lot to do with knowing yourself before you go in there. You don't go in there blind. You don't go in there swinging, wearing a blindfold. You go in and make things knowledgeable, and the place you start is looking at your own self. You look at your own way of looking at what you find in the world. You look at the things you find amusing. You look at your own stories, your own the gaps between your own dreams and your practices, which is again where comedy lies. You look at all the things that are funny about you first and foremost, and you make your comedy any kind of humor that you're making, and yourself is the butt first, and that's a place of great safety, because no one's going to complain, oh, he made loads of jokes against himself. that where they're going to where they're going to be where they might be heading to HR, as if you pick on the smallest, if you're punching down, essentially you pick on someone without power, you pick on somebody who's vulnerable and use your strength, and that's not being funny, that's just bullying. So comedy is, what I'm talking about is nothing to do with that. It's a much more grown up and much harder route to look at yourself and look at the world properly.
One of the things you said to me when we first met, which really resonated with me, was when people think about comedy, sort of how do I become more funny? One of the obvious routes out there is to go and do stand-up comedy. And
Yeah.
so there is this sort of line that says, if you want to be better at speaking, if you want to make yourself more amusing, then go do stand-up comedy. And I talked to you about the fact that I'd been interested in doing it. I thought it was necessary to do it, but I'd never done it. And you rightly pointed out that there was a reason I'd never done it, right? Because it's not like I'd lacked the time or the money to go do it. Can you just talk us through that? Because I think it's genuinely, if you were to sort of Google how do I be more funny, stand-up comedy was the one thing that presents itself, and there are courses out there that you can do.
Yeah.
That feels like the gateway that one ought to take. And your point to me was that that's not necessary.
I don't think it is. I think stand-up comedy is a whole theatrical practice in itself. It's a lifetime's work. A lot of those people spend 3 or 4 years doing nothing but stand-up comedy to get even half good. And I think stand-up is a different world. It's like saying, I want to get fit, so I'm going to join the Olympic 10,000 meters training squad. Even though I'm 55 and I'm 6 stone overweight. No, you don't do that, do you? You do things that are in proportion. And I think the thing about stand-up is it's very much a job. And if you're going to take those courses, it's because you fancy doing the job of being a stand-up. And a stand-up exists within a culture and within an industry. And a stand-up world is a world unto itself, and it has its rules, and it has a very different contract with the audience. And I think it's very, very different to business speaking or real life speaking, because essentially a comedian standing up there with complete license to entertain whatever it costs. If they have to take their clothes off, and some of them have, to get a laugh, then they will. If they can swear, they can have a go at people in the audience, they can really, really get political. They can do whatever it takes to get laughs. They can construct fantasies. They can make stuff up. Now that's a very, very different contract to the one you have as a business speaker, for instance, standing on a stage where your job isn't to come up there and just say whatever it is that's in your head to get a reaction. You're up there to tell truths, to give insights, to give people the benefit of your experiences, to give people the benefit of your ideas. There's all this other stuff that you're doing. That's the main job you're doing. And that's what people want from you. They don't want any of that from a comedian. No one's interested in what a comedian has to say about building your personal brand, are they? So that's why they can make that's why they can make all the jokes they like. And that's the job. And so the idea of spending 2 or 3 years, yes, there are transferable skills. Yes, it's great stage time. Yes, it's a lovely way of learning how to use things like surprise and change of pace and storytelling. Yes, it's great. It's good experience, but it's not the only experience. And actually, it's an experience of something that ends up being slightly different to what you're trying to do I mean, to me, it's as much to do with business speaking as, I don't know, being a vicar's sermon. I mean, because when you think about it, a vicar's standing up there, right, in front of people, all sat there in nice, neat rows, wearing quite nice clothes, a lot of whom don't really want to be there, but just feel they ought to be, telling quite important things about life to that group. Well, that's probably more to do with business speaking than stand-up comedy, but no one says go off and train to be a vicar, do they? So, yes, yes, I'm doing a part-time stand-up vicar course. I should start running one and see if people like to come. But I mean, it's ludicrous as well, isn't it? I mean, that has that enough. That's a parallel skill. And yes, if we all did some preaching in Church of England churches with 6 people in the audience, we could learn something. But it's not something you have to do in order to become a better business speaker. You just have to look at your core skills and work on what you've got that's appropriate for what you're trying to do. And I don't think learning to be a stand-up really serves you as a business speaker as much as it serves the comedians who are doing it to top up their income. And bless them, who can blame them?
Well, you would do that, right? Wouldn't you? It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
One of the things that is really comes out when I've spoken to you before around sort of comedy and what's funny is that we have a view, and I think stand-up comedy perpetuates this, particularly the dealing with hecklers, for example.
Yeah.
There's a perception that it's all spontaneous, and that here are some really, and I think this is why partly people think they're not funny, is because there's this view that if you take someone like Jimmy Carr, very, very quick, if somebody heckles or criticizes on a TV panel show, somebody says something, and there is this out of nowhere, there is this response where you sort of go, wow, that was a skill, and I don't have that. My brain doesn't work that quickly. And the bit that I found fascinating was when I was talking to you, you were saying, well, a lot of these things that look spontaneous are actually incredibly well rehearsed. Right?
No.
This is not something that it's not necessarily what it seems.
I'm not
to craft to it.
Not to decry Jimmy Carr's skill, because I'm sure he is a very smart and quick comedian. But if you look at the programs that you're talking about, down the credits, there will be this wonderful thing that you've probably always wondered about called program associates. Now, program associates are what people call, is the words they use to disguise their writers. Because when they have people who want to convince the world that they've made it all up themselves, they don't want the words writer on the credits, because that people think, oh God, well, the writers wrote it. Well, in fact, the program associates probably wrote it. If you look at the credits from most of these comedy shows, you will find at least 4 or 5 program associates, who are the people carefully crafting these ad libs, carefully crafting these spontaneous jokes, which are then put into the show. And if they don't quite deliver them right, they stop and start again and do it till it's right. So, TV has very little to do with the real world, and it's a fantastic artifice that people spend a lot of time trying to make look natural and real. Whereas actually what goes on is quite normally, as it should be, because people want a polished product. They want things that are as good as they can be. I mean, an episode of Friends, I never got to see one, but a friend of mine went to a recording of Friends. The way in Britain they do sitcoms they used to do them in a very kind of old-fashioned theatrical way, like an evening out. Basically, it was like an evening out for coach parties. And they would do them on Sunday nights because all the actors were free on Sunday nights because they weren't in the West End. And they did them on Sunday nights, and they bus in these people, and it would start at 7:30 and it would have to end at 8:45 because the bus was outside. So that's why when you look at a lot of British sitcoms, you think, oh God, they didn't do that bit very well. But they didn't have time. They had to carry on. They had to do it almost like a little play.
The show must go on.
The show must be made. So even if they completely screw up the scene or the joke, that's it. You've got to move on. And Friends was recorded in America over a 12-hour period. They had Thursday was record day, and there was a big queue of people out, and you came in and you stayed until you got bored and fed up, and then you went home again. They didn't care about the audience. They just did and redid every scene. And if that scene wasn't quite working, they'd stop. The writers would all get together. They'd rewrite it on set. They'd relearn it. They'd stage it again, and then they'd do it until it was right. And that's the thing about a lot of this. Everyone says, oh, comedy's natural. I'm not naturally funny. If I just said to you, stand there and be funny, I'd freeze. Well, I tell you what, 99% of TV comedians or would freeze. Very little of that is as spontaneous as it looks. It takes a comedian between 1 or 2 years to come up with their hour-long Edinburgh set. And they write this stuff, and then they take it on the road and they try these jokes out, and then they rewrite them. And that's why they always appear in these little comedy clubs. And these things are not made in an instant. And being funny in a speech isn't the work of an afternoon. You don't just sit there and go, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do is I'll Google a few jokes and I'll stick those in the beginning, and then I'll Google a few more and I'll stick them in the end, and then I'll have and then I can be boring in the middle, but everyone will love me because I've been funny at the beginning and funny at the end. And you know what? That's not really going to work for you, especially not now, because people know that that's what you've done. People can feel, you're telling generic jokes that they've probably read themselves on the internet. It's like a wedding speech that's been done by people who've Googled, what jokes should I do at a wedding speech? And you hear the same 3 or 4 good jokes that they use that everyone else has used because they've just Googled it. It's got nothing to do with them. And a real speech, to be a real speaker, to be authentically yourself, and where this really adds value, is it's something that's done as part of a process. And just as you wouldn't stand up and talk about, all the straight boring things without practicing them or working them through or trial and error, you don't do that with the funny stuff either. Everything is worked, everything is looked at, and it takes time, and you settle it and you make it authentic and you make it true to you. It's got to be as true as the rest of the stuff you're saying. You don't make up figures and stick them on a PowerPoint, do you? Just because I think, well, that looks great, I'll just make this up.
I think some people do.
Well, maybe they do.
But you're right. You should.
You probably shouldn't. Or make up some research that proves the point you're trying to say, and then put some spurious professor's name at the end of it. But you don't do that. So likewise, the funny stuff has to grow organically and be nurtured, and then it can make a real impact. Because if you think about it, so many speeches are like this. If you look at them as a big desert, everyone thinks, oh, funny, I've got to be really funny. It's really interesting that the amount of funny that people need, because what they're not expecting you to be Jimmy Carr. Jimmy Carr, as I said, his only job is to go there on stage at the O2 and be funny relentlessly for the 90 minutes, because people have booked a babysitter, they've paid 150 quid for the tickets, they've seen him on TV, they know what they're coming to get, and that's what they want. They want an hour and a half of just funny, because that's all there is. That's what's going on. In your speech, you're going to have, as I said, lots of other things to talk about, lots of other points to prove. And being funny, being warm, being humorous, adding humor only needs to be 5 to 10%, 5% of that. You only need to do it 2 or 3 times, because if you look at a desert, when you stick a couple of green plants in a desert, have a little patches of green, it really stands out, doesn't it? And most speeches are just deserts, aren't they? Deserts of humanity, where people have forgotten to be human. And then when they are human, when they are funny, when they are truthful, when they're emotional, when they're warm or surprising, or they let you in, or vulnerable, those things, those patches of green, are hugely impactful. So you don't need to do lots of it. You just need to do it well. And you just need to do it in a way that's totally authentic to you, and chimes and grows out of your personality and your worldview, which is not someone else's worldview, not jokes off the internet.
Yeah, so interesting. This isn't about follow, because if I look at lots of training and lots of things, it's sort of, if you follow this. So if I think about diets as a good example, right, or fitness regimes or any of these other things, they sort of follow this plan, right, and you will get to the promised land. Now we know intuitively that a ton of these things is bullshit, right? Yeah. It's just not gonna necessarily work. But what's really interesting about the way you describe it, though, is clearly that's not a standardized approach for every single person. So if you had 2 people sitting in a room, you wouldn't necessarily develop the same program for them. And I guess intuitively, in the same way, we kind of know that diets will depend on our body shape and our metabolism, all that kind of stuff, ditto fitness, all these other things. We sort of instinctively know that. And what's interesting is the way you're talking about it is it really does have to become a sort of a part of you, and it has to work for you. And therefore, what the stories you might like to tell, the way you might present yourself, that's got to come from
a personal thing, and therefore it is a very sort of tailored. What you're talking about here is really a tailored approach, and this isn't a standard. Just do these things and then you'll be fine.
Exactly, because everybody has a different kind of funny in them, to be honest. So when we try to draw something out from the well, people's wells are all very different, and they contain different experiences and ideas and natures. Because your comedy, you're finding your funniness inside you. It has to be absolutely congruent to who you are. You can't force it. All of those cringy things. It's like David Brent, for example, in The Office, would be absolutely fine if he was just going around chatting to people. It's because he thinks he's a stand-up comedian. Is his tragedy? It's not that he wants to connect to people and he believes that work should be fun, because in a way, he should be doing keynotes around the world on that at the moment. But his problem is that he expresses that by trying to do stand-up routines, and he hasn't got the material. So you've got to sort of find something that works for you in your true essence. That's the journey that we do. And when it comes to talking, so yes, it is a very individual thing, and I love working with people one-to-one and drilling down over time and finding the essence of who they are, what they can become, and how that works for them. And when it comes to larger groups, I guess I'm sort of beginning to give people the permission to think about this, giving them some places to go with it, to give some sense of progress and where they can go next, and asking the right questions, helping them to ask the right questions of themselves, and giving themselves the confidence to go, well, this matters. I can do this. I'm not entirely sure how, and I have to find the answers sort of within myself, but with some help of people giving you some structures and the right questions and the right ways forward. So yeah, it's a totally individual journey. Everybody's fighting. It's playing golf. It's not tennis. Is the way I look at it. You're finding your funny is a personal thing, and you're playing against the course of life. You're not really playing against the person next to you. So that's what's great about it. It's not competitive. It's totally you, and you'll get there if you're honest with yourself, if you work hard, if you're prepared to take a few risks, because you have to take a few risks to be good at anything in life, especially when there's a time you have to do the material and see if people laugh. You have to say something funny and see what happens. And so if you could take a few risks, but in a nice, managed, safe way, then you get that growth, and you'll find yourself, you'll be more comfortable in your own skin. You'll be saying the kind of stuff that you say with your best friend. The idea is really to get to the point where in public or at work, you are the same person at perhaps a different volume level than you are at the best night out with your friends. Because I guarantee that that's when you're funny, aren't you? Everyone's funny then. Everyone's being funny, and that's the place you need to find where you can turn that spring on in a nice, controlled way at work.
To your point, one of the things I find fascinating is it's stand-up is terror. The idea terror. So I'm not the idea of standing in front of an audience to speak doesn't scare me per se, but the idea of sort of like I'm now required to be funny and perform in a way that, as you say, I'm never going to have to do. That sort of puts me on. And what was interesting is, on the one hand, I talked to you and sort of said, well, thinking about it, there is a reason I haven't done that. And so when you've got an alternative path, you start to go, okay, well, that sounds like an easier path. But what is interesting about the approach that you're adopting and the way you just talk about it is it's not, it's easier in the sense of, I haven't got this sort of sweaty, waking up going, what am I going to say later? Sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't have to memorize a whole load of stuff, but nonetheless, right, there is an interesting element of confronting oneself.
Sure.
And I guess and so in many respects, the way you just talked about it reminds me a bit of a form of therapy. And I'm not suggesting it's analogous to that, because obviously you're not driving at the same objective, but nonetheless, one is required to confront aspects of one's own, it's almost back to the ridiculousness of human existence and the sort of stupidity of it all, and how we're all a bit dumb. And so one has to kind of come with a view that I don't think Donald Trump would do particularly well.
I don't think Donald and I would get on terribly well. I don't think so. I don't think that Donald would open himself up, which is why he's always going to be the target of humor rather than the person who ever manages to create it, because he's just a closed book, isn't he? He's a shut door. And so you can throw things at a shut door. And I think what's interesting about this is you're opening the door on you know, the stuff that you've got, the stuff that you're already good at, and just adding to it. It's more fleshes in your arrow box. What's the word for an arrow box? You know the one. You're just adding more arrows to your box.
Arrow. We'll
Arrow
call it
box.
an arrow book. That's fine. Yeah, yeah. And it's struck me as again that as you were talking just now, but also as the conversations I've had in the past, that obviously what makes for comedy generally is experiences.
Yeah.
And so, sure, if I spend my whole life at home, funny things, stuff that's amusing is going to happen. But there's a greater likelihood of things that are funny happening if I go do stuff, or if I go out into the world and
Yeah, yeah.
experience things. Travel would be an example, but trying new experiences. So opening oneself up to ridiculous moments
Mm,
seems to me to be a key aspect of this. And if I
mm,
think about my own experience, it's when you go on holiday that something absurd happens,
mhm.
right? Or just and so almost there's a joy to this, which is to sort of say, go out and live life,
Mm.
because that's how you're going to come up with the raw materials, if you like, to be funny about. Because
Yeah.
if you didn't experience anything, you'd have no stories to tell.
Exactly. And and look at the people I'm talking to are people who are having experiences all the time. They're not living, they're not living in a library. Most of these people are living in quite a complex world, but they're going out there, they're doing things, they're meeting intelligent people, they're looking at people who want something from them, they're trying to make a difference. And the great thing, in my other life as a comedy writer, when you're creating a great comedy character, what you want are busy characters. The best comedy characters, if you look at Del Boy, for example, if Del Boy just sat in the flat talking, he'd be far less interesting. What's great about Del Boy, and the reason he's funny, is he's a striver. He's always trying to do things. He's always trying out new ideas. He's an entrepreneur. Everything's different every day, and his ambitions are marvelous. And then they meet the reality, and that's where the comedy comes. And that's the same thing for you. You've got to start thinking of yourself a little bit as a comedy character out in the world, recognizing that you're doing things, and in doing things, your character and your personality and your truth is coming up against the world, and the gaps that are opened up, or the sparks that come off you hitting the world, are the stuff that we want to hear about. And that's what I'm talking about. The funny can include triumph. It's not all about disaster at all, because it's about your personality in its fullest account of itself hitting the world, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the stuff that we want to hear about. So you need to put yourself into your speeches. You need to put those moments where you've engaged with the world, where it's a past you, where you're awestruck, or you're full of wonder. It doesn't have to be negative stuff. It's just your whole heart and your whole soul. You need to put as much of that as you can into your speeches without, to me, embarrassing people or boring them or being self-indulgent. You've just got to sprinkle a little bit of the stardust of your real self onto these things. And that's what will bring anything that you're saying up a level, because you're not talking in generic terms. You're not using buzzwords to cover yourself, because let's face it, buzzwords are just disguises, are just bits of armor you plate yourself so that people don't know who you are, because you're using these words that mean nothing, and they mean nothing, and everyone knows they mean nothing. So everything that you're saying, when you're doing a really good account of yourself, is unique, is in the moment, and is truthful. And that's what I think. That's kind of what I'm talking about. So yes, it is a little bit in a funny way. I mean, I've been doing this with clients. I sort of I see what you mean. It sort of doesn't stray into therapy territory, but it strays into the real self. Because there's no point doing this and concocting a bogus version of yourself. Say you're the most miserable bastard in the world, and what we've done is you create this big, sunny, lovely, hilarious. But it won't stand up to scrutiny, will it? Because as soon as the lights are off, you'll be found out. And I think this has all got to be authentic and truthful and integral to everything that you are and everything that you do, because it's all coming from you. Therefore, once you do this work, it becomes easy. It's like all of those things where you get in touch with your real self, life becomes easier as a result. You're not having to constantly fictionalize. You're not having to constantly triangulate between reality and yourself. You're just being yourself. And actually, weirdly, that's a lot easier, isn't it? So yes, it's tougher at first, like a lot of these things, like your diet analogy, or getting fit. It's tough at first, but then after that, people say it's the easiest thing in the world to get up and have a 20-mile run, which sounds appalling to me, but I know, I know what they mean. What's that? That's what they do say. I'm going to believe.
Right? Yeah. I've heard it said, right? Exactly. And I mean, one of the things that is interesting for me in the job that I do is I spend my whole life and I walk around with what I sort of call behavioral lens. So I find myself regularly, like he said, pretending it wasn't driven by me, but I find myself in situations where I'm photographing stuff, or I'm staring at things and it can be weird stuff like in the supermarket, a sign, or just something that's happening there because there's some angle that's relevant to my work. And I wondered, with your sort of view of the world and experience, are you constantly on the lookout for things that are sort of comedy gold or moments that will resonate? Can you switch off from it?
Yeah, that's the trouble. Yeah, I sort of, you train yourself to switch off, but actually then you miss out. But I mean, you can't be on alert, full alert 110 times, 100% every moment, every day. And that's the difficulty of being a creative watching person. You have curiosity and you notice this stuff, and you try and take some notes, but try not to take notes all the time, because otherwise you're just an observer and not actually living. And that's always the challenge for creative people. But when you're doing this, I think you've got to, lots of people who've never really been alert, never really taken notice. I think one of the things is you start to take notice, you start to think about yourself and look at what you've done. And, when you're in a situation, you can ask people later on, why did you laugh? But you can sort of see, you start paying attention to why that was funny, what was going on there, a little bit, the subtext. And also like you do, and the phone is your friend, isn't it? When you can take pictures or take notes really quickly and say, that was an extraordinary thing, and I need to think about that, and why was that funny? And yeah, you need to pay attention, because if you just go, well, I'll remember it. Well, obviously, like a lot of things, we don't remember them, do we? So we do have to take notes and be aware. And it's finding a balance. But I mean, for a lot of people who've never done it, I mean, I think you can't do too much of it to start with, because it just starts you having a kind of a critical frame of mind. You look at, like I always say to people when they're starting this, look at the comedies you like and start trying to work out why you like them. And really not just, oh, they're funny and they make me laugh. Why has it made you laugh? Why has that program made you laugh, or that comedian made you laugh, and not the other one? And try and see, well, what buttons are they pushing? What bit of your life is that? What bit of your life is Ricky Gervais more truthful to than Mrs. Brown? Because Mrs. Brown, everyone gets very snobby about comedy. Mrs. Brown's very effective mainstream comedy that millions and millions of people like. So there's something about Mrs. Brown that chimes into lots of people's lives. Otherwise, it would not be successful. It's the iron rule of life. If people like things, they like them for a reason. And it's not just because people have told them to like them. So things like comedy that Del Boy got under people's skin, because I suppose that was how everybody felt, when in Thatcher and everyone was trying to make a living and trying to get around the how are we going to survive this? And so Del Boy was a kind of a sock puppet for us all, for our own struggles, and he was kind of a comic version of Thatcher entrepreneurship, wasn't he? Everything's a dodgy deal, but he chimed with millions of people's lives as they were experiencing it, and they felt the world like Del Boy, and that's what you're looking for, is the stuff out there in the world that feels true to you, that resonates with you, and you could see that becoming part of one of your stories, that actually tells the story of what you're saying in the rest of your speech. If your speech is about risk and you see somebody doing something where they failed to take a chance because they are so risk averse, or the sort of things that you might put on LinkedIn, that all of those things are just perceptions that then could turn into anecdotes, could turn into stories when you speak. And that's it. Yeah, it's just using the world as a kind of a cork board that you interact with.
It's interesting you mentioned the social media, because I think there's a I'm not suggesting every single person on social media is playing, but it is about dance videos appeal to people for certain reasons. There are little
Mm.
short comedy sketches. There's lots of opportunity there for people to be creative, and we see that coming out. And I think one that plays into your theme of everybody can be funny on some level, and pull those things. But that's really what's, if we look at that as social media grabs a lot of attention, right? Okay, it's algorithms that are cleverly pulling what we need to know, but what is it we're looking at? It's stuff that's engaging us and stuff that's unique. And I do think, as I look at people on social media that I like, it is people producing content that no one else produces.
Yeah.
The generic crap that frankly anyone could have produced is less appealing than something where you go, actually, that's not replicable.
No.
And it's not something that anybody, because it comes from that individual's experience.
Exactly. And that individual voice. And that's what you're seeing, is that, and it doesn't have to be, to reference an earlier point, it doesn't have to be 45 minutes of material, does it? I mean, a 15-second post can work just as well, and it tells that's entertained you and grabbed you, and so when you think about it in those terms, it's not about vast amounts of material. It's about having the right kind of material that's truthful to you, and is unique and has a point of view, which is what all speakers do. And if they don't have a point of view, get out of the road, really, because there's no need for you anymore. There's a bot that can do that job for you if you haven't got a point of view. So, I mean, that's the other thing. That's the other part of all this, Christian, is that look what's happening in the world. In the last, since I started this a few months ago, it's all completely game changed since Christmas and all this, everyone's suddenly seeing what this AI revolution is going to look like. I mean, there are bots out there who can do bog standard presentations standing on the head in 125 languages. Thanks very much. And you just pay £20 a month or $20 a month to use them. So the idea of just standing up there going, well, key point 1, what you have to do is this. All that stuff's over. You've got to have a personality. You've got to have a point of view. You've got to have a spark. Otherwise, you're out. You're out of the conversation. Don't need you. So when you talk about risk, the biggest risk for people, in my opinion, now is not doing this, not doing something to absolutely foreground your defined, manage, use, and foreground your humor, your personality, your uniqueness, your generosity to the world. Because to me, funny stuff is the ultimate generosity. It's so easy. The easiest thing in the world is to just say, report what is. The hard thing is that, when you're sitting around a group of friends and somebody just say, oh, I'm very angry at Boris Johnson. Well, that's fine. But the person who comes up with something that's different about, different about Boris Johnson makes the effort to find a different way of talking about that. They're the ones that you are going to like and be interested in. Anyone could be angry. Anyone can state the facts. Not everyone can. It takes effort. It takes effort to bother to try and be funny, to try and be original, because it's a war against cliche that we're living at the moment. So who wants to be a cliche? So everything about being funny is about originality and making the effort. So it does take effort. It does take effort. The easiest thing is not to do it.
And that point around technology, I think, is really interesting, because when we look at what technology can do, natural presumption is it's going to do spreadsheety type stuff. And so we might stretch into the world of saying, well, lawyers better watch out, right? Because AI is coming for you.
They'll find a way around it, Chris. You know what lawyers are like. They'll make it illegal. They'll make it illegal not to use lawyers. They're very, that's what they're good at. They're
very canny, yeah.
They own the politicians anyway, so they're all the politicians are lawyers and the lawyers are politicians. So they'll make it illegal not to be a lawyer.
Your point around driving creativity, because on the face of it, you would sort of go, well, technology is all about ones and zeros, right? And so therefore isn't that human thing? But I think there is something interesting about what it is doing to us, and where if we looked at it as sort of the tide is rising and we need to get away from it, we run up to the mountain. Where are we running to? And I think you make a really good point around, well, we're running to the things that the machines can't do, right? Which is the unique aspects that make us us.
Yeah.
And machines are logical, right? So we're all about creating comedy. I think sometimes it works because it's illogical.
Yeah.
And it's pulling out things that's out of context and stuff that you wouldn't get to if you were thinking logically and sensibly, because that's what makes it engaging.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where so many of the big laughs in life are the mad, illogical things my Irish mother said to me, but she thinks it's true. There's a truth for her, and there's possibly a truth in it as well somewhere. But some of those things that she says, just what? And they're the things that a machine would never do. I mean, that's the thing. Machines go for perfection, and machines try and get things right. And actually, most art is conjured from lots of things that are slightly wrong. Characters that aren't quite true, aren't quite achieved. And I think they'll probably get there. Who knows? I mean, they might get there in 5 years' time, but they're such a long way away from it right now. They're an awful lot further away from that human voice stuff of true creativity than they are how to do a spreadsheet. That's for sure. Yeah, if I was doing spreadsheets for a living, I'd be much more concerned than I am about doing comedy for a living. because I think they're a lot further. The cyborgs are a lot further off. Not known for their sitcoms. They're not a barrel laugh.
One of the things I think is so interesting as you talk there about processes is in many respects comedy is inefficient, because it is, if I take, for example, someone like Eddie Izzard, the joy of some of that is that it's a bit meandering and it wanders around and you're like, where the hell are we going? And that's the joy of it, because you suddenly go and you get slapped around because you end up somewhere you weren't expecting to end up. Yeah. And so if I looked at it from a sort of efficiency perspective, sometimes it's an inefficient way to communicate, because you have to build up and tension those things. And so if I look at some of the other narratives around, there's been lots of noise recently about, well, we need to do things as efficiently as possible, cost effectiveness, all these sorts of things. And just-in-time supply chain to be another example of that. And we saw in the pandemic, actually, that fails when the circumstances under which the presumptions is made around the world fall apart. And so as you're talking there, creativity and comedy are not efficient. And we spend more time listening to things and stories take longer. But that's why we like it, because we're not, as human beings, we're not all efficient and effective, and sometimes we do ramble on a bit and illustration now in the way I'm asking the question. But yeah, there is something around that makes it joyously human, and that's another reason why I think the machines will take some time to get there, because it's counterintuitive and it can feel a bit wasteful, I guess. Because the effort that goes into creating a joke, all of these things, what have you got? And there's a lot of time wasted as well when we think about that. A lot of stuff that remains on the proverbial cutting room floor.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because over the years working with producers, because a lot of people get these ideas into their heads, and they have the TV comedy version of that efficiency, time wasted stuff. And, they all go on a course and they work out that on certain American sitcoms, they were getting 4.1 laughs per minute or whatever, and then they come back and they get their stopwatches out and they try and make a comedy script work like that. And they want more and more jokes. And what you realize is it's a bit like a lot of these things, it's the things that are left out. It's the gaps between them that make things appealing to people. And actually, if things are too efficient, too punchy, too many jokes, it's a really interesting thing. I did a sitcom once years ago with Hugh Bonville, who's now in Downton Abbey, and we did this sitcom, and it was actually, I remember the recording was such a weird thing. Again, it was one of those Sunday nights full of people in on a free ticket from the supermarket employees or whatever it was, and they were all there, and it was getting a bit late because they'd had a technical problem. And we had a really good warm-up man, which was a disaster because he was too funny. And the thing is that he's really, really, really brilliant warm-up man.
Can you be a bit more shit, please?
Yes. Well, a lot of them are quite shit, frankly. A lot of the quite famous stand-ups I've seen started as very bad warm-up men. But he was really, really good, and he's never really made it as a TV comedian, but he's a brilliant warm-up man. And he was too funny with them. He was got to a real role, and he just wouldn't stop. And by the time we got to our funniest scene, and it was a funny scene, even though I wrote it myself, we'd rehearsed it. I know it was a very, very funny scene. It was delivered perfectly. We did it to absolute silence in this huge studio in LWC. We did this great comedy reveal, total silence, because it was 9:45 and everyone was all laughed out. They'd laughed their laughs. They had no more laughs left in them. They were tired. They wanted to go home. They wanted their bovril and they wanted to be in bed. And there's something about that efficiency thing that doesn't work, because people need the slightly boring bits in an evening at the theatre to find the exciting bits exciting. To me, that's why I can't watch Hollywood action movies. They're just a relentless action, which I find incredibly dull. If they'd sit there and have a chat about their parents or something like that for 10 minutes before they shot each other in the head, I'd find it much more interesting. But I'm not very typical, maybe. But
I mean, it's true. It always reminds me of like the Bond movies, where it's
yeah.
sort of like these villains are idiots, right? Because they
Mm.
explain to James Bond how their setup works,
Yeah,
so he
exactly.
can take it apart, and then there's always a tedious conversation about how they're going to kill him,
Yes, and
right?
here's
And so
what
that's part of the construct.
and here are my internet passwords, Mr. Bond, which I suspect you'll never get to use. Ha 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 ha. I mean, they're ludicrous. But yeah, I mean, most action films are really, to me, very boring, and fighting is really boring. But lots of other people like it. But sometimes you do need that lead up. You do need pauses, and there's a human thing about we're all still around the campfire. The bison has been slaughtered. Ugg is doing the cooking tonight. He's up there. We've all got our caveman beer in one hand, and we're just hearing a story while the food is cooking. And we've got all the time in the world till the food cooks. And there's deep in us is these rhythms of how stories need to be introduced without going too far. You need characters, you need setting. That's what so many people, when they're trying to tell funny stories, forget about. They don't paint pictures. And one of the things that I work on clients with is painting pictures, because people think visually and see a story in the context. Where is this happening? What kind of room is this? What kind of how tall are they? If you can paint these little pictures, then people are hearing stories that have human beings in them, and human beings are interested in stories that have human beings in them, and that is where the beginning and end of what I really do is about. It's just trying to say to people, the more human beings you put in this, the more people will listen to you, the more people will find it intriguing, the more they will think it's about them. Because everything in life is ultimately about us, about ourselves. I'm listening to you because I'm thinking what's in it for me. You're listening to me for the same reason. When you're standing up there talking to 500 people, every single person's going, what does this do to me? What good is this to me? I know I've been sent here by my company, but I've got to report back to Jane in HR about how much I enjoyed it later. But you have that person sitting there, Lisa sitting there, is going, what use is this to me? And if it's no use to her at all, she'll switch off. But if you are telling her stories about really interesting people that are like the people that she's met in her world, or your dad is strangely a bit like her dad, with the things that your dad said to you when you were young, it's just like what her dad said, then you've got a connection and you're talking about her. And everything to do with speaking really is effective when everything you're saying has a intellectual and emotional resonance with the people who are hearing it, listening to you, sitting there in that seat. And sometimes they need a bit of time leading up to it, these stories, but that time is bringing people into the world of your story, making people, feel part of it, like a game. I mean, I'm not a gamer, but don't games take a while to warm up, and they show you the world, and it's not get through the doorway and start shooting. I mean, some of it is, but you need to feel the geography. You need to feel the cast list. You need to have a sense of the weather. You want to feel where you are, like turning up in any country. You want to go out there and have a nose around and see what the locals are like, and you want to see where you are first before you do anything. And I think that's part of storytelling.
When you were talking there, it reminds me of this. I think people don't necessarily ever express this, but it's implicit in the way many things are presented. There's a presumption, and compliance is one example. What's happened? It's sort of, this is really important, therefore you will listen.
Yeah.
Right. And it's because it's important from the perspective of the person telling it. So if your job is health and safety or compliance, or whatever, you'll go, I've got a very important message here. And so often a lot of these things are missed, right? Which is the subject is so important, I'm just going to tell them and they will be a captive audience. And we don't need to bother engaging people. And I take the opposite view, which is to say that the more important it is the more you have to make sure that you are. And actually so I flip it on its head and kind of go, actually, the stuff you've got a greater chance of people paying attention to, ironically,
Mm.
and the serious stuff. And we see this with airline safety briefings, right? You might not always like them, but they do try and grab your attention
Mm.
because actually, logically, you ought to want to know what happens if something goes wrong. But we don't. We tend not to listen to tedious airline safety briefings. Hence, they bring in comedians and famous people and interesting scenarios. But I think that's often lost in many business contexts, or even sort of as we go around the world. I've got a serious message, and they're just going to listen. I think that's a missed opportunity because you really do. If it's that serious, you need to engage them.
Absolutely. You need to engage them in everything, using all the weapons at your disposal. And that's what's great about your book, is back to people. Because, yes, the rules and the compliance are important to the company, but they're only important to the people if they feel an emotional connection with them, if they feel that they are about them and their lives. And by using these rules and doing this compliance stuff, their careers, their life will be better. Their company will be better, and they'll be in a prosperous place. These things then start to connect. And it's likewise with stories. The stories work because, there's a thing about, there's some research, there's a book I read about it, and saying that, Jon Stewart, and he does his, the Daily Show, Jon Stewart, and that with, when he was doing it, so it's an older bit of research, but in terms of people's knowledge of current affairs, the people who watched Jon Stewart were something like 40% more informed across the piece of American current affairs and remembered 40% more about what's actually happening than the people who watch the news. So the news is there giving it completely straight. And that is the perfect contrast to me. That's exactly what we're talking about. People watch the news. It's delivered 100% straight. It's delivered with no humor. It's delivered with no humanity. It's delivered like a series of facts, even though we all know it's full of subconscious messages and it's full of biases and all those things. But it's delivered like it is the word of God. And actually, people remember 40 or 50% more if the same facts are delivered through the lens of a comedy show and a comedian, making them laugh. Because people remember things far more that are expressed in a humorous way than if they're just done as a bald fact. It's science tells us that. Capital S, science.
Wow. As ever, Paul, I could keep talking to you, but we are running out of time. So before I let you go, tell my listeners how they can get hold of you. And I'll put links to all of this in the show notes, but let's just give it to people audibly so they can remember it that way as well.
Well, check me out at truefunny.co.uk, or I'm on LinkedIn as Paul Dornan, as in Jamie Dornan. It's good to have a big star now. People know, because people never knew how to spell my name before. They always wanted to make it Doran. Paul Dornan. And the company's True Funny, and I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to work with more highly intelligent friends of Christian. That would be a great joy to me, because he's a lovely man, and this is a lovely way to work, working with very intelligent people, trying to tell the truth about the world. So that's what's great. I'd love to do more.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you so much. One, I wouldn't have had you on the show if I wasn't enjoying the time that we were spending together professionally. So thank you so much for all the things you're doing, but secondly, for being a great guest on the podcast.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Paul for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Paul, to see that video that he referred to, and to find out about his company True Funny, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. You'll also find links to my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, and you can find out where you can read some sample chapters for free before diving into the book as a whole. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do leave a 5-star rating and a review if possible on whichever platform you use. It really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe, see if you can find your true funny, and thank you so much for listening.